Today I'm discussing my book number 13. The 13th book is Nigerian Labor Laws and Interventionist Policies. It has to do with employees and employers and how government has been able to intervene. My name is Professor Silvanus Okeke. This is a book that treats the labor law in the country. Nigerian labor laws have the origin from British labor laws. This has been obvious. Nigeria was formerly a colony of Britain. So that's why the labor law is derived from where it is the source. Who are the people that make the laws? It's a law that is made not only by labor, but is derived from the Nigerian Constitution itself. It is a book that talks about the Labor Law Code Act of 1916. That's the origin. It is a book that also talks about intervention and interventionist policies by government. Government is always intervening with labor in such a way that things don't move, and that is why you have the unions fighting. Before the period, the labor law itself came directly from the British labor law. The Labor Law Code of 16, though well meant in intention, did not satisfy the harsh condition of the period. This act has continuously been updated to the present Trade Union Act of 1974. The book in chapter 2 talks about the Colonial Development Act of 1929. It goes ahead to talk about the development of the labor law through the 1930s. The International Labour Law Organization adopted the first Labour Convention, and in 1933, the Nigerian government passed the first Labour Ordinance number 22 to implement some decisions of the ILO Convention. So the interventionist policies came in discussing the Colonial Development Act of 1929. Some features are very relevant, and some of them are uneven and unequal development of the colonies, the level of literacy, unskilled labor and artisans found in the system, the issues of labor scarcity and forced labor, and the rising cost of labor inflation. These were issues that the government did not just see kindly. Government opposition of any form of act at that rudimentary stage in terms of development was therefore ill-conceived, because government was always intervening in what they wanted to do in labor. Then came the Trade Union Ordinance of 1938, which is detailed in chapter 3 of the book. In 1930, Lord Patchfield sent a dispatch to British colonial governors to introduce trade union legislation after he had witnessed increased union activities, particularly in the railway. In fact, it started from the railways. This is discussed in the Trade Union Ordinance of 1938. Significant features of the ordinance were the enactment of the 1938 Trade Union Ordinance, which coincided with the Second World War. The discontent culminated in strikes, which eventually brought about the spread of union activities in Nigeria then. Therefore, economic and political forces were instrumental to the introduction of that legislation. Government involvement in industrial relations, as they claimed that time, became imperative so as to prevent labor exploitation and ensure a reasonable standard of working condition, maintain industrial peace, and encourage industrial harmony. But even at that, government was always in support of employers as against employees. Union tendency to proliferate was fostered by the loose construction of the ordinance, which made it possible for any group of the employees or two employers, if they close, to form a union. Then policy of intervention is discussed in the book. Questions arising from the features are, some of them are listed here. Why was government not equally interested in both the union and employers association? Why were they interested in the unions only at that time? Was it out of ignorance, or that someone did not do his work well, or was it a deliberate colonial policy? Why were workers merely encouraged to organize on plant level? What happens at the organizational leadership? These things were all listed in this book. Criticisms of the 1938 ordinance is discussed. Registration requirements, trade union definitions, the defects which are noticed. What are the requirements? These are listed also in the book. So the book has a detail of all the early ordinances and where government wanted to stop or interrupt these policies from working. The Trade Union Ordinance of 1938 came into force on April 1st, 1939, and M.A. Imodu led the Railway Workers Union through the first ever known registration in 1940. So the details are given in this book so that if you have it, apart from going through the labor ordinance, apart from going through labor laws in Nigeria and how it was received through the British labor laws, you also have what happened at the initial stage through the railway unions. The loose definitions are also here given. The local associations, including the Lagos Union of Functionaries, are all detailed in the book. Was it ignorance on the part of the government that they ought to intervene, or was it a deliberate policy to retard the growth of trade unionism in Nigeria? Some of these questions are answered in the book. Then there is the Trade Dispute Arbitration and Inquiry Ordinance of 1941, which is also detailed in the book. The features of intervention, as at that time most acts enacted were solely controlled by the colonial government. The act provided for reconciliation between labor and employers once there is any crisis introducing such problems to the officials in the Department of Labor. All these things are written in the book. With the enactment of the Act in 1941, government started intervening in disputes and in all labor matters arising between trade unions and employers. And with that kind of intervention, often it is unusual. Both parties have areas of conflict, which is normal. All in all, only very slight use of this act was put into play before it became suspended by more rigorous Interventionist Act of 1968 and then 1969, and finally by the Trade Dispute Decree of 1976. On and on. Then there is the Workers' Compensation Ordinance of 1941, which is also discussed in the book. The Labor Code Ordinance of 1945 is well discussed in the book. The Factory Act of 1955. The Nigerian Factories Act of 1955 is patterned under the English Act of 1937. The English Act has been consolidated with subsequent amendments into the existing Factories Act of 1961. All these are listed in the book, the sections and the content of the Factory Act. Obnoxious policies and issues by government were all listed in the book, which you will find very, very interesting. Then there is the Wages Board Act of 1957, and there is Intervention 2. The Wages Board Ordinance laid the foundation of very serious intervention, as will be seen after the consideration of the Wages Board and Industrial Council Decree of 1973. The committee approach, which has remained till date in the nature of commission, has exhibited to a great extent government interventionist posture in industrial relations in the country. Wage fixing should be on the basis of collective bargaining and nothing more. If there is no collective bargaining, there should not be wage fixing by any of the parties, the union, the employers, or government separately. The book in chapter 6 discusses the National Provident Fund Act number 20 of 1961. One of the early known social legislation in the country, the National Provident Fund Act of 1961, was conceived to provide for the payment of invalidity, sickness, or withdrawal benefit to persons who have been members of the National Provident Fund for at least 2 continuous years. That was detailed also in the book. Policies of the intervention is also listed. So on and on, the book is a complete encyclopedia of Nigerian labor laws and interventionist policies by government. There is the Trade Union Dispute Emergency Provisions Act number 21 of 1968, which is detailed in chapter 7. The interventionist policies of government is also brought into play. Then there is the Trade Union Decree of 1973, which the book discusses. It's a book that any student of industrial relations, any student of labor, any student of labor law need to have in his shelf. Intervention, many establishments have been dissuaded from forming unions, and when there are no unions, of course you know that the collective bargaining will be very poor, and either the employer or government will cheat the workers. Trade Union Decree of 1976, Conciliation and Arbitration Act is listed there. Who is the mediator? Who is the conciliator? They are all listed in chapter 8 of the book. The arbitration panel, how is it formed? The arbitration tribunal shall make his award within 42 days of his constitution or such longer period as the commissioner may in any particular case allow. These are detailed in the book, and the points are raised from making his decisions known to the amendment of the decree number 54 of 1977 rather. Then there is the Trade Union Amendment Decree 1978, the check-off system, a new provision on the registration of trade unions, the creation of a separate union for junior and senior staff. You have to either belong to the junior or the senior staff. The immediate registration of 70 unions provided for in the Schedule 3 to the decree, and the recognition of the Nigerian Labour Congress as the central labor organization in the country. All unions other than association of senior staff or employers are hereby deemed to be affiliated to the Nigerian Labour Congress. Overall assessment of interventionist policy is also listed. Interventionist policies are as old as trade union practices, at least in Nigeria. As far back as 1920, Mr. Williams, a colonial officer, had overreacted over demand for wage increases. The 9th January strike by the mechanics in 1920 could have been avoided but for the interference of obnoxious policies. So it has been on and on and on. Whatever is brought into play, there will be intervention about them. And this is what the book talks about. So you don't just read trade union laws without knowing where policies have been made to counter these laws. This is what the book is about. This book also, a 100-page book, is available at Amazon.com, and also you could get through this book through the internet. Thank you.